¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Bienvenidos a una nueva edición de EnFoco de Pivotes. Como siempre, junto a mi compañero Sebastián Rivas, presentado por Pivotes y en colaboración con Exante. Desde ya les pido disculpas por mi garganta, don Sebastián Rivas, pero tuve una graduación muy gritona.
Hace muy poquito, José María del Pino, ¿cómo estás? Mucho gusto nuevamente estar contigo y lo anticipábamos la semana pasada. Hoy día tenemos un invitado que de verdad habíamos querido tenerlo hace mucho tiempo, pero es, yo te diría, una de las personas de referencia cuando uno piensa en cómo determinamos qué es lo que hace exitoso un país o qué es lo que lo logra llevar en el camino del desarrollo y qué cosas son las que no. Es algo que nos importa mucho en Chile, en un minuto donde estamos teniendo una conversación que va más allá del proceso constitucional. El proceso constitucional es una parte, pero sobre cuál es nuestra perspectiva y nuestra mirada a país en el mediano y largo plazo. Y por eso, José María del Pino, yo te voy a dar ahí el pase para que hagas la presentación de nuestro invitado. Vamos a recordarle que nuestro invitado habla en inglés, nosotros vamos a hablar en inglés, pero ustedes no se van a perder nada porque vamos a tener subtítulos en toda la transmisión, así que desde ahora en adelante, cuando José María del Pino hable, el programa es en inglés. José María, te dejo a ti la presentación de nuestro invitado.
Thank you very much, Sebastián. It is a huge an honor, a great pleasure for me and for you, I know, to introduce our guest to this conversation. He's a professor of the University of Chicago, and he, in my opinion, has written two must-read books about the key role of institutions into the development of the country. Professor James Robinson, thank you very much for coming to talk with us here at Pivotes. And you may know that in Chile we used to read you because you have taken our country in some of your examples about institutions and development. So that's why it is an honor for us to have you here. Welcome.
My pleasure.
Should I start, José María?
Absolutely. We always ask in this program, Professor Robinson, who should first? And on this time, this is going to be Sebastian.
I will go first. Professor Robinson, we have a lot of issues that we can talk about, but there's something that really struck me. You came to Chile a couple of months ago, invited by McKinsey to a seminar, and you have been to Chile many times, and you have been an observer of our society. Was there something that struck you related to our mood or our conversations or the topics that we are talking about that you perceive as something that is different or a change regarding the previous times that you came to Chile?
Yes, I think there is. I think there's a very interesting discussion about the society and about the problems of the society and about how to move forward and how to address those problems. I think that's right across the sort of social spectrum. I think this whole process of rewriting the Constitution and rejecting the Constitution, I think that's actually very healthy. It's a process of deliberation and kind of social discussion. And I was very impressed. I met a lot of business tycoons, and I was very impressed at, despite the terrific economic success of Chile in the last sort of 30 or 40 years, which I think is undeniable, there's also a recognition that that model that's brought that success has problems. And you have to address those problems if you're going to move to the next stage. And I think that's exactly right. So for me, it was a very exciting ambience.
Just to for the sake of the comparison, Professor Robinson, that's something that we shouldn't take for granted. That's something that is not happening in other countries, for instance, of Latin America?
Oh, not at all. No, I mean, I think, if you contrast that with Colombia, and you looked at the narrative of Colombian business tycoons, you'd find they're all in complete denial. They just they can't understand how can people have voted for this left-wing president after we've given the country so much, So I think it's radically different, or you look at the situation in Mexico at the moment, or, where you have these President López Obrador, who's sort of trying to deinstitutionalize the country. And, so I think even President Boric, you could say, well, he's left wing. Sure, he's left wing, but he's completely different in the way he thinks about the world and the way he thinks about society and institutions. And yes, he may disagree about the institutions. People may disagree, but that's fine. That's legitimate, and you have a legitimate process for resolving those those disagreements. And I think that's what makes a successful society, to be honest with you. If you ask me, why did Britain become as successful as it did, I would say that the British people have legitimate ways of resolving disputes and disagreements and kind of moving on. So, and I think Chile has that in a way that probably no other Latin American country does, and that's very exciting.
Professor, sorry, José María.
Go ahead, Sebastián.
There's something, in your words that really struck me. That is, we, in the political horse race conversation of day to day, we are very obsessed, with the final results, like having a new constitution, and what would be saying in that constitution. But I'm understanding, well, you are telling us that we should cherish the process and enjoy the process. The process itself of having a conversation broader than the constitution, but related to our institutions, what should be done in Chile to progress. That should be something that we really must, value as something that is useful for us to go into a new development state.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at Argentina. If you look at the attitude of the Peronists, if you're not a Peronist, you're an enemy, and they do everything to disrupt and destroy, and that's you can't build a prosperous modern society with that kind of attitude towards fellow citizens. So I think this process of bringing Chileans together and debating, and I think that's incredibly healthy for creating a successful modern society. I mean, it's painful and a bit disorienting while it's going on, but I think if you look around in other places in Latin America, you see that doesn't happen. People vilify opponents and they marginalize people who don't like them. And look at the narrative of in Chile compared to Venezuela, or in Colombia at the moment, or in Mexico, or so I think that's or Argentina. I think that's dramatically different, and it's very healthy for me.
Mm-hmm. That's something useful, because our conversation has been, related to the final goal. But I remember that when we were discussing a couple of years ago, and in 2015, also, in 2019, but in 2015, what could a new constitution do for Chile? You said, okay, this is not big, this won't do the change that is necessary, basically, right now, I feel that you are in a position that, probably this can be most useful because it sparked a conversation than for the content itself of the rules that a constitution can have.
Yeah, I think the process is very important. Look at how many times the Latin American countries, rewrote their constitution in the last 200 years. How many times did the US write a constitution? Once, okay? And what's the difference between the US Constitution and most Latin American constitutions? It was written through an incredibly legitimate process. After they wrote the Constitution in Philadelphia, all the states had to ratify it. They all had to vote to accept the Constitution. There was a year of debate and discussion. People rejected it. They had to pass the Bill of Rights, to kind of deal with some of these objections. So that took time. But that's how you write a legitimate constitution. Look at the way constitutions were written in Colombia, until 1991. One side won a civil war and they imposed the rules on everybody else. You can't write a legitimate constitution like that, And so I think you're doing the right thing. It's I think if you look at all successful constitutions, it's always a messy process like this because people have to be heard and they want to be heard and they need to be heard, for them to buy into the framework. I think it's right. You can't solve all your problems with a constitution. The constitutions need to be implemented. Many things need to be interpreted. You can't micromanage society with a constitution. But I think it's an important moment of kind of moving on for Chile from kind of disentangling itself from the military and that legacy. And that is a new era for the country. And I think it's great.
And I just want to take your last sentence when you said you cannot micromanage society with a constitution. And if we read the first draft, I mean the first attempt of constitution in Chile, it was more similar like to a governmental plan than a constitution. They were trying to create a legal framework to establish, I guess, a new kind of society based on the ideas of just one sector of society, in this case the left side. And if you analyze the modern constitutional discussion, everything is more about how you create just big rules to let the politicians and the politics just develop their own ideas, and the people choosing different congressmen, presidents, to allow them to create the change. But this was a very rigid one. They were trying to create like a legal framework to orient our society in just one direction. Do you agree with that statement? Because that's the big critic that people had made to that draft.
Well, I think, I think it's people had that perception, and that's part of the reason why the constitution was rejected, so and then you have to try again. So I think that's, to the extent that the initial design had these flaws that you're identifying, people rejected that. So that's good. That shows the process is working. If you look at the 1991 Colombian constitution, it's full of like ludicrous kind of details and attempts to sort of, for the constitutional court to set wages and many things that's just impossible to implement in practice, So yeah, I think that's right. You don't want things like that in the constitution, and so you try again, and I think that's what democracy is like.
And I also want to take you to, I think, the most important question, because in Chile, we choose the constitution as a driver to create change for society, a more equal society, justice for more people, better health system, better education system. But it is just a driver. Is there any other way, in your opinion, to modernize our institution in Chile, not taking the constitution as a driver, maybe some other kind of changes? Because the country seems to be paralyzed by the constitutional discussion, and the country needs to keep moving meanwhile we discuss that new constitution.
Yeah, I think the constitution can, determine rights and sort of general principles, but implement how you actually implement any of these things that's much more the work of day-to-day politics and what types of parties and interests are represented in the government and the capacity of the state. And so I think that trying to build prosperity and trying to promote inclusion and equality, you can't do that by fiat in a constitution. You can establish some principles, but the actual principles are going to be implemented in the kind of day-to-day politics, and the day-to-day, and that's about educational policy. It's about, trying to encourage social mobility and, and that's about day-to-day policy. So I think the constitution can kind of frame that, but then the Chileans have to kind of understand what the problems are and what kind of policies are going to solve those problems. If you're going to promote social mobility and promote, inclusive institutions, then there's going to be lots of little details that you have to sort out and figure out and how to address that. And that's not what you do in the constitution. That's day-to-day policy making.
You have been studying Chile a lot. I love to read you when you talk about Chile, because I feel that you are actually a Chilean academic trying to interpret our country. But being honest, Professor, in your opinion, was the new constitution necessary in order to create more inclusive institutions in Chile? Did we choose the right driver to try to deliver this new future for our country?
I think it's a good idea, because I think you have to disentangle yourself from this history of the military, to be honest with you. And like in my experience, this period of the military is very polarizing, even now in Chile. And you should just get over that. So it's one way of setting that behind you, it seems to me, in a kind of very symbolic way of kind of just moving on from that period, So I, could you have kept the economy moving without rewriting the constitution? Yeah, maybe. But, these symbolic things are very important sometimes, in terms of bringing people together and kind of recognizing what we have in common. And, just some things are just very polarizing. And I think that, so from that perspective, maybe it is important and you did need it, I guess I would think.
Professor Robinson, in Chile, obviously, we have been talking about a new social pact for more than a decade, and the constitutional discussion obviously has something of that idea, but in your books with Professor Acemoglu, you point out usually that these pacts, are often agreements between groups like broader than the political world or civil society, businessmen, workers, and how could we as Chile, lead to something like tangible or some structure perhaps that can facilitate this conversation to advance into a social pact?
Well, I mean, I think it is doing that. You have strong political parties. You have very strong institutions. I mean, like for me, Chile is just like one of the facts I like most about Chile is that if you put up a table of all the Odebrecht scandals in Latin America, Chile is not on the table. This is just, like that's something to be extremely proud of. My wife wrote her dissertation in Chile, and she interviewed people who'd been repressed by the military. And, she worked with this Valic and Retic reports, and like what is fabulous about that is that everything is there, all the people are there, it's all kind of done in this very sort of above board, proper kind of way. And then she tried to work in Argentina and do the same exercise. Impossible. It's impossible. There's no information. People won't give you the information, so there's just at some deep level in Chile, institutions work well, I think, and that's a remarkable thing. I could give many examples. Just elections, there's no people don't complain about fraud or the type of things that are discussed in almost every other Latin American country. So there's this just, you have that institutional playing field, which I think is just fantastically difficult to build. And, you have political, so people play by the rules, you have political parties, so I think, I don't know what you mean by a social pact. I think, yeah, you need a collective agreement about the rules and we operate within the rules and there's give and take, but it happens within the rules and we make decisions within the rules. But I think that's what you have already in Chile. And, I think this constitutional process, shows it in action. Now President Boric is, he's not happy with the latest iteration of this process, but fine, he believes in the rules. He's not going to try to overthrow the rules. So I think that's the way for me things work. Whether everyone agrees and you have a pact, I don't know that you need that. You just need the rule of law in some kind of fundamental way. And different people have different ideas and they have different interests, but that's perfectly consistent with that's true in the United States. It's true in any kind of developed country. So I don't think that's an impediment to prosperity. And you learn what works, what doesn't work. What will work for Chile, what needs to happen in Chile. You need to have a debate about that. But I think there is a debate about that.
Professor, I was thinking about something that you said before, that is, that we should look at the importance of changing the constitution as a symbol, as a society. And I was thinking, that, this process was, the latest process was started by Sebastián Piñera, that he was the president of Chile, but he wasn't just the president of Chile. He was also, one of the main billionaires of the country, somebody that embodies, the mix of the political and economic power as a symbol. Is that, is that important, that Sebastián Piñera had, started the process and open to change the rules and the constitution?
I think it's very interesting. Yes, that's not a person you'd have expected to initiate that process. So I think it's important, but I think he did that in a moment where many of the sort of problems of Chile that were latent sort of came to the surface, and he was smart enough, and not just smart enough, but also, believed in the society and believed that, that he had to do something as a statesman, and I think that's pretty amazing. Yeah. So yeah, I think it is significant, and it's to his great credit, I think.
Professor, we have a huge problem of trust in Chile. People is not trusting institutions, is not trusting politicians. People looks to be maybe choosing different alternatives that sometimes are seems like outsiders. That's the case of the Republican Party in Chile during the last election. They are a new political party. They had just 6 deputies in the Congress, or 12 deputies in the Congress, and now they are the main political party of the country with 37% of the votes. Why? And this is not just a thing about Chile. Why is people choosing the outsiders, and what should the politicians and the politics and the institutions do in these times to recover the trust of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important observation. I think it's sort of a phenomena which is happening, in many parts of the world, not just Latin America, but also Europe and the Philippines, and I think in the Chilean case, you can see instances where which clearly reveal why people don't have a lot of trust in some things. There've been a lot of scandals, for example. There've been a lot of scandals with business people, cheating the system, and all these collusion scandals, and people going into sort of fake prisons or getting ethics lessons, instead of going to prison. And so sort of collusion between elites, economic elites, business elites, and I think that's the sort of thing that massively erodes trust in the system. But I think that the only way to reestablish trust is to be sensitive to what people want, and to kind of resolve these problems. I mean, I think there's a great example is if you look at Greece and Spain, for example, when this economic crisis hit after 2008. There's an enormous collapse in trust of politicians and the political system, and you get all these crazy fringe parties appearing, especially in Greece. But what was remarkable in both cases was the ability of the politicians and the political class to respond to that. And also the system was very democratic, so new people could come, and new people could people could try new ideas and policies, and they realized, oh, that didn't work very well, and so there's a period of flux where different options are on the table. But in both cases, the extremists disappeared, like in Greece, almost totally, and a much more kind of centrist consensus approach here, like rebuilding the country, resolving institutional problems, moving the country in a different direction. So I think there's always these challenges to particular institutions, and that's what you're describing, it seems to me. But I would say, what country in Latin America is in a better position to kind of reestablish trust, than Chile. I mean, I was very impressed at this meeting I was at in March, with a lot of business people who were extremely aware of these issues, and like very sensitive to ideas about, okay, how do we solve this problem? They're talking about the problem. We need to solve this problem. That we need to solve this problem with trust. How do we do that? I think that's a great discussion. I think that's challenging many political systems in the world. But I think the only way we know of establishing trust is to listen to people and take their views seriously, and try to implement policies that improve their lives and give them a future, give them hope in the future, and expectations of social mobility. And
sorry, Sebastián, I'm going with one more question. In the case of Chile, we usually say, Professor, that these laws of trust from people is opening a window or maybe the door for the rising of a populism leadership, or maybe a new path to democratic erosion, because the main idea under this sense of not trusting institution is about security and safe of people. So some people used to say that, well, we are opening the door maybe for an Nayib Bukele in Chile, someone who's going to come here like a sheriff and gives safety for everyone. But at the end of the day, we are going to lose some rights, and a process of democratic erosion could begin. Do you agree with that idea? Because that's the main issue in Chile at this moment: safety, security. If you see the polls about the trust in institutions, you will see that the Chilean police, the Chilean version of the FBI, and the army forces are the most trust institution of our country. Over 80% of people trust of them, and this is telling you something. We want to fight the crime. We want to fight the international organized crime that is coming to Chile. So, what's your opinion about that? That framing that has been installed in Chile during these last years.
Yeah. I mean, let me say one more thing about trust that I wanted to say that I didn't, which is, I also think part of the issue with trust in Chile is that, people's expectations are much higher in Chile than in other parts of Latin America. I think Chileans can kind of see there's this potential, in Chile, which doesn't exist in any other Latin American country. There's a potential for Chile to become a really developed country in a way that no Colombian, could possibly imagine, or no Argentine could possibly imagine, I think. And I think that then you have very high standards. So then you get really upset with something that no Colombian would get upset with. So that's, for me, part of the issue in Chile also, but that's a good thing. You have high expectations and you're disappointed because you fall short of your expectations. But the big picture for me is that's actually an important thing. I mean, it's difficult for me to think of Chile as being a unsafe, place, compared to Salvador or Colombia or, more or less anywhere else in Latin America. I mean, my experience in Chile has been, that it's a very orderly, well-run place, so it's a bit difficult, for me to get into the sort of mindset of people who are, so concerned about order. And, but if they are, I think then that's a very important thing for the government to address, because if, I guess, again, maybe that's just used to historical, it's a change in historical standards where Chile has been completely safe and orderly, and then there's some deterioration in that. You're not anywhere near the Salvadorian levels, but for people it's unusual, it's kind of abnormal, and they're anxious, But I think so. That's a reason for kind of prioritizing that as a policy issue, it seems to me. But again, for me, it's very hard to compare Chile to these other places, and there's very deep reasons for that. If you go back into the 19th century, Chile doesn't look like other Latin American countries. It's like the best. It has the strongest state. It's much better at building railways and roads. The military, is the most effective in Latin America. It's for me, Chile looks different. It's not just the last 40 years. It's the last 200 years. It's always been on a different kind of trajectory. And yeah.
And what about the path to democratic erosion? Do you see it possible in Chile?
Not really. No, not really. I don't say, I mean, of course, these things tend to come out of the blue. Donald Trump came out of the blue. But the big picture is that the institutions were strong enough to deal with Donald Trump. And I think Chile has very strong institutions too, relative to other Latin American countries.
Professor Robinson, there's something that usually comes when a Chilean is speaking with somebody from other countries, related with the pandemic. In Chile we had like 1.5 years of kind of curfews, and obviously, there were people that didn't comply, but it wasn't the majority. The majority stayed at home. And when you talk about that, with people of other countries, I usually, the answer is, why did you do that? And why didn't you protest? Even in a moment, after the estallido, the big demonstrations. Probably there's something that we still have this like deep trust in our state, our institutions, our that probably is operating even at that like micro level.
Yeah, but I think that's a sign. That's an important indication of the some of the advantages that Chile have. That they did build up. What was it? Gordon Brown, the former British Prime Minister, said that in building the rule of law, the first 500 years are the most difficult. And so I think there's problems with the rule of law in Chile. Like the way I talk about it is, it's like the rule of law with favoritism. It's a bit like Qatar. In Qatar, there's the rule of law, but if you're a member of the Al Thani family, the system favors you. But that's a very well-defined group, the Al Thani family. And I think Chile is a bit like that. You have the rule of law, but in the past, the system has favored some people. It's favored people who graduated from some particular schools. There's been a kind of very well-defined elite. But the thing is, it's like the elite is defined by kind of ascriptive characteristics. In Colombia, anyone could be elite. Any kind of drug lord or mafiosi or kind of gangster imagines himself as president. Pablo Escobar wanted to be president. Like that creates this enormous rent-seeking kind of unstable equilibrium. And in Chile, you don't have that. But I think, and Britain, like think about Britain. Britain still has that. Britain has the aristocracy. If you have a Norman French last name, you're more likely to get into Oxford and Cambridge than if you don't, even holding constant other characteristics. So Britain, I'm British, look at, we just had a coronation. I understand rule of law with favoritism, but Britain succeeded by relaxing that and relaxing it. And I think that's what's happening in Chile.
Professor Robinson, when you are discussing the Constitution, it's also, a moment when you can look at other experiences, and bring something that, you don't have and that could improve your, your situation. And in Chile, if we look at something that we could bring, some innovation, thinking in something that you have looked in other parts, and it is interesting. It is something that we should give a look. What kind of institutions or ideas that are, being developed by other countries should we look as something that we could like copy or bring to Chile, as a new, group of institutions with the Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have a view on that. I think in Chile, this whole issue of education and, social mobility is very key. I think, there's some very good research by Seth Zimmerman, who was formerly my colleague here at the University of Chicago, who's now at Yale, looking at social connections and, the difference between private high schools and public high schools and how that affected, the payoff from university education. I think, for me, I think these issues of educational policy, it's not a coincidence that, many of these protests in Chile, revolved around schools, around education, so I think that's the crux of the matter, So what, and there have been, very important attempts to reform educational institutions and, to kind of create a more level playing field between these private and public schools. But, what's exactly the best way to do that? Because you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You don't want to throw out the success, and the extremely high standards of private schools in Chile. I have several Chilean PhD students who studied in those schools, and and they're very brilliant young men. So you need to build on the strengths, not destroy the strengths. And so I'm not a specialist in educational policy, but it seems like that's an area where you want to think a lot about different models and figure out what worked in some places and what didn't work, and how do you build on the strengths but make the system more inclusive. You know, that's, again, I'm not an expert on that, but it seems like a very important thing to think through.
Professor Robinson, we have done this exercise before with international guests in our space. So I'm going to create a fiction scenario for you. Let's say that you had been invited by the president and the Congress and the Supreme Court of the country to a meeting with them. You are going to be the only speaker, and they will ask you, Professor James Robinson, what's your advice? What our country should do in order to create more inclusive institutions and to move further to the future? What would be, your advice in that case if you have the president, the Congress, and the Supreme Court asking for your advice?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to tolerate everybody, to tolerate everybody's opinion, and to kind of appreciate that people have different ideas and different opinions. It's not a coincidence that, the great British political philosopher John Locke, who wrote his second treatise in government, which is a sort of, it's kind of design, it's a sort of intellectual design for many, many modern constitutions. He also wrote a book called a treatise on tolerance, and I think that is very important. You have to respect other people's, disagreements, and you have to respect other people's right to disagree, and you have to take that seriously and talk to each other. You're all Chileans, you're all building a project together, and that's what you don't have in Mexico or Argentina or Colombia, and I think you have it more in Chile. But to me, that's critical to just getting a collective vision of a prosperous and successful Chile.
James Robinson, University Professor at the University of Chicago and Institute Director of the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolutions of Global Conflicts at the Harris School, my school. I cherish, I was there.
I'm delighted. I'm delighted, and I'm feeling yellow, Sebastián, because you had the opportunity to have him as a professor. But I'm also very happy with my university, my graduate school. So.
Go Chicago. Thank you, Professor Robinson. It was a pleasure to have you here, and we hope that if you come to Chile again, we can talk a little bit more about this ongoing conversation that we have as a society. So thank you very much.
I'm getting a lot of invitations for the fall. Yes.
That's nice. Wow. So
you are very, very famous in our country.
Okay.
So José María, you can go with the outro in Spanish right now.
Yes, queridos, muchas gracias por haber estado con nosotros. Qué placer esta conversación ha sido con el profesor James Robinson de la Universidad de Chicago, escritor, a mi juicio, de 2 libros que todos debiésemos leer. The Narrow Corridor. ¿Cómo está traducido al español?
El pasillo estrecho en Chile. El
pasillo estrecho en Chile es la más reciente publicación para que la puedan leer. Muchísimas gracias, profesor. Don Sebastián, próxima semana, nuevo programa EnFoco de Pivotes, como siempre presentado por Pivotes, en colaboración con Exante. Mañana pueden leer el resumen escrito de esta conversación. Seba, que estén bien. Buenas tardes.
Que estén muy bien.